A chilly autumn wind swept through the back alley of the symphony hall. The clear sound of a violin quietly resonated in the narrow lane. 10-year-old Carol Davis tightly wrapped an old blanket around her shoulders as she pressed her ear against the service metal door. Someone was practicing Tchaikovsky's violin concerto. The beautiful melody seeped through the thick walls faintly. Every day at 3 p.m., Carol would come to this place. From her dwelling, a small tent concealed between two garbage bins. The music at this hour was a temporary escape from reality and a solace for her heart. Closing her eyes, the violin's voice enveloped her, making her forget she was sitting on the cold concrete ground. The performer was Elizabeth Anderson, the orchestra's first female concertmaster. Carol knew her name from a commemorative concert poster on the building's front. She had never seen Elizabeth perform in person, but felt familiar with her through the daily practices. Elizabeth's playing conveyed not just technical perfection but a deep, emotional understanding that resonated powerfully with Carol's young heart. It had been 4 years since she ran away from her foster home. She couldn't endure another day of the discipline inflicted by her foster parents. Even now, the memories would sometimes resurface. Hours locked in a dark storeroom, slaps thrown for minor offenses, and being told repeatedly she was unwanted and abandoned by her biological parents. But Carol knew her parents hadn't abandoned her. They died in a traffic accident when she was 6. Though the memories of their love were fading, they remained her most precious treasure. The realities of street life were harsher than imagined. Mornings were spent collecting cardboard behind convenience stores to shield from rain and wind. Meals meant lining up at a nearby soup kitchen, where she was often shoved aside by adults and always ended up last. To satiate her hunger, she would scavenge for leftovers behind restaurants. The cold was her greatest enemy. A worn blanket was hardly enough to fend off the night's chill. In the depths of winter, she would sneak into subway stations or public restrooms to spend the night. If caught by security, she was thrown out, and at times, nearly reported to the police. Her clothes, cherished gifts from church charity, grew increasingly inadequate as she grew taller, and she could only patch them when they tore. Her hair grew long and unkempt, her face and hands were perpetually dirty. Washing up at public faucets required avoiding people's eyes. Passers-by's glances were cold. Adults who noticed her looked away as if she were invisible. Sometimes they watched her with a mix of pity and disgust, murmuring, "That girl is also homeless." Other children would whisper, "Look at that girl," and keep their distance. Carol gradually learned to avoid crowds. She roamed quiet backstreets by day and hid in the shadows at night. Yet occasionally, she encountered kindness, like a librarian who suggested books to warm up or an elderly volunteer at the soup kitchen who gave her extra servings. Her memories with her biological parents sustained her through tough days. Her father would always take her to the park on his days off. Her mother sang lullabies to her every night. They weren't wealthy, but theirs was a home filled with love. On the day of the accident, they were on their way to buy her a birthday present. Since then, Carol had never celebrated her birthday. Her introduction to music came on a cold day in a library, captivated by the sound of a violin from an old radio, reminiscent of her mother's lullabies. Since then, she wandered the streets in search of music, eventually leading her to this concert hall. Listening to Elizabeth's daily practices, Carol began to discern nuances in sound and predict the flow of the pieces. Sometimes, she sensed something different in the music, as if she had a special sense within her body to feel the sounds. To those who saw her on the streets, she was just another homeless person in dirty clothes. But while listening to music, Carol felt special. The music gave her dignity, free from the need to mind others' prejudice or sympathy. As today's practice neared its end, Carol quietly stood up. Tomorrow, and the day after, she would be here, waiting for the music. It was her small, yet certain, hope. Little did Carol know, as a street-dwelling girl unnoticed by many, that she would meet a top musician, a meeting that would dramatically change her life. In the early morning, the rehearsal room was enveloped in silence, still unvisited by anyone. Elizabeth, wanting to focus on a new piece, entered the venue earlier than usual. As she opened the door, a faint sound came from near the normally empty back entrance. Quietly heading towards the sound, Elizabeth saw a small shadow. In the dim light, Carol tried to stand up hastily, attempting to flee. Elizabeth gently grabbed her hand. "Wait," Elizabeth's voice sounded soft. "Don't be afraid." Carol stood frozen, her clothes dusty and her hair long untended. But what Elizabeth saw in the girl's eyes was something beyond fear or wariness, a pure shine, as if hiding deep within. "You've always been here, haven't you?" Elizabeth said quietly. During her practices, she had faintly sensed someone listening. Carol remained silent, but her eyes desperately pleaded. "Don't let go. Don't take the music away." During yesterday's practice, the part one messed up. Elizabeth continued gently. "Did you notice?" Carol nodded slightly. Then, for the first time, she spoke. In the third movement, the sound was different. Elizabeth was surprised. Indeed, she had made a mistake in the pitch the day before. That Carol had an ear to notice was unexpected. "Let's sit down," Elizabeth gestured towards the edge of the stage. "This morning, you're my only audience for a private concert." Hesitantly, Carol followed her onto the stage. It was her first time being up there. A completely different view than looking up from the audience seats. Elizabeth positioned her violin. As the bow touched the strings, the music began to fill the space. Carol gasped. The live performance was utterly different from what she had heard through the walls. It directly moved her heart. Mozart's Violin Concerto No. 5 flowed elegantly, permeating the dim venue like morning mist. Carol closed her eyes, feeling the music with her entire body. Occasionally, Elizabeth didn't miss the subtle emotional changes appearing on the girl's face, as if she were conversing with the music. When the final note faded, a deep silence flowed between them. A special silence shared between those who had experienced something beyond words. "You can come here to listen to my practice any time," Elizabeth said quietly. "I'll leave the back door unlocked for you." Tears shimmered in Carol's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were an expression of the warm emotions welling up from the depths of her heart. "Thank you," Carol's voice trembled slightly. Elizabeth gently placed her hand on the girl's shoulder. She sensed something special within this child, something undoubtedly profound. "Come again tomorrow," Elizabeth smiled. "Will you be my important listener during my practice?" From that day on, a special morning scene was added to the concert hall. A lone girl quietly sitting at the edge of the stage, listening to the concertmaster's practice. Unnoticed by anyone, a special time flowed quietly, connected only by the music. One morning, after Carol had become accustomed to listening to Elizabeth's performances at the edge of the stage, the tranquility of the rehearsal room was disrupted by an unexpected visitor. The heavy wooden door opened with a loud noise, and a tall man appeared. It was Elizabeth's husband, Richard Anderson. Carol reflexively hid in the shadows of the stage. In contrast to Elizabeth's warm atmosphere, something cold seemed to emanate from Richard. His perfectly tailored suit, glossy leather shoes, and icy gaze were striking. Practicing early in the morning as usual, true to the artist of our household. Richard's voice contained a hint of sarcasm. But there is an important matter this morning. Elizabeth stopped playing and lowered her violin. What is it? Why so early? It's about next month's special performance, Richard approached as he spoke. The sponsors have put forward new conditions. They want a selection that appeals more to the masses. But the program is already decided. Tickets have been sold. Business sometimes requires changes to the program. Richard's tone was cold and cutting. Your artistry is important. But you need to see the reality. Carol listened intently to the conversation, holding her breath. Each of Richard's words seemed to slice through the air like sharp blades. Music isn't a commodity. Elizabeth's voice was calm but resolute. Everything is business, Richard sneered. Your pure love for music is fine, but I want you to see reality. It's time to graduate from your childish ideals. At that moment, a small noise came from the shadows where Carol was hiding. Richard's sharp eyes immediately caught the direction of the sound. Is someone there? His voice grew even colder. Elizabeth quickly responded. It's just the cleaning staff. They've come early in the morning. Richard showed a hint of suspicion but did not pursue further. Anyway, the change in the program is decided. We'll discuss the details tonight. After he left, a heavy atmosphere lingered in the room. Carol slowly emerged from the shadows. Elizabeth's face bore a fatigue Carol had never seen before. That man. Carol hesitated. Yes, my husband, Elizabeth sighed deeply. Don't worry. This is our problem. But Carol understood. The incident was not just a marital dispute. The cold light in Richard's eyes reminded her of the hostile intent she had seen in her foster home. Can I still come here? Carol asked in a small voice. Of course, Elizabeth smiled gently. This is a place for music. I won't let anyone disturb it. Reassured by those words, Carol nodded. However, a sense of unease sprouted in her heart. The shadow cast by Richard's presence over Elizabeth's warm world of music seemed to be growing larger. From that day forward, Carol became more cautious, especially when Richard appeared. She made sure to hide perfectly, not just out of caution, but driven by an instinctive impulse to protect Elizabeth. Behind the rehearsal room ran a narrow ventilation duct. Carol occasionally heard conversations during Richard's visits through it. And the content of those discussions was slowly developing into a frightening conspiracy, unknown to anyone at that time. Several days have passed since the incident in the rehearsal room. A slight tension could now be felt in Elizabeth's performances. Carol noticed more fluctuations in the sound than usual. Not due to technical issues, but as if the musician's heart was trembling. One night, through the ventilation duct, Carol heard voices from the orchestra office. Louder and more heated than usual. It was Elizabeth and Richard. Enough. Elizabeth's voice echoed. I can't change my music for the sake of your business. Your music. Richard's voice contained a sneer. My investment group supports this orchestra. Artistry is fine, but look at reality. Investment? or embezzlement. A moment of silence followed. What are you talking about? Richard's voice grew menacingly low. There are too many irregularities in the Foundation's financial reports. The board has also pointed them out. Elizabeth's voice trembled, but her resolve was unshaken. Limit your unnecessary prying. Richard's voice was as cold as ice. And remember, I manage the estate entrusted to me by your grandparents. It's easy for me to divert the funds meant for supporting young musicians to other uses. More threats, Elizabeth interrupted. Don't twist my grandparents' intentions to suit your needs. The conversation escalated in intensity. Carol leaned against the wall, trembling as she listened. I'm considering a divorce, Elizabeth suddenly declared. Silence filled the room. Is that so? Richard's voice was eerily calm. But that would be the worst decision for you. I advise you to reconsider. Are you threatening me? A warning. And Richard paused significantly. Lately, I've been hearing concerning rumors about your surroundings. What do you mean? Rumors of the principal musician fraternizing with a homeless child who sneaks in and out of the back door. What do you think that would do to your career? Carol's heart raced as she realized her existence was putting Elizabeth at risk. A loud sound of a door slamming echoed, and heavy footsteps faded away. Carol faintly heard Elizabeth sobbing. Then, a gentle voice came from behind. Carol? When she turned around, Elizabeth was standing there. Her eyes were slightly red and swollen, but her expression was kind. I'm sorry, Carol looked down. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. Come here, Elizabeth said quietly. They sat at the edge of the stage. After a moment of silence, Elizabeth spoke. It's getting colder, isn't it? Carol nodded slightly. Her thin jacket was no longer sufficient against the night's chill. Wait here for a moment. Elizabeth went to the dressing room and returned shortly, holding a deep green wool coat. This was mine when I was a teenager. It's a cherished keepsake, but Elizabeth draped the coat over Carol's shoulders. It fits you perfectly. The warmth of the fabric brought tears to Carol's eyes. But, for someone like me. Someone like you? Elizabeth smiled gently. To me, you're just a wonderful girl who truly loves music. Those words felt like they were slowly melting. Something long bound inside Carol's heart. At the foster home. For the first time, Carol began to share her past. The days she was locked in a dark storeroom. The senseless violence, the night she had to run away. Elizabeth listened silently, occasionally placing her hand gently on Carol's back, soothing her trembling shoulders. I lost my parents when I was 5, Elizabeth began quietly. It was a fire. My grandparents raised me. Music was the support for my heart. They talked until late into the night about music, dreams, and the loneliness deep inside their hearts. From now on, you can rest in the dressing room on cold nights, Elizabeth said. I won't tell anyone. Overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't put into words, Carol felt truly at ease for the first time, wrapped in the warm coat. On the morning of the commemorative concert, Carol woke up in a corner of the dressing room, wrapped in the green coat Elizabeth had given her. She should have been in a deep sleep, but was awakened by footsteps in the hallway. It was Richard's voice. Is anyone watching? Yes, yes. The reply came from Michael Foster, the orchestra's cellist. Usually a low-profile individual. Why was he here so early? Carol peeked from behind cover. Michael's face was pale, his body trembling slightly. Put this in Elizabeth's water before rehearsal. Richard handed him a small bottle. It takes effect immediately. She'll feel ill and faint during the performance. But, Elizabeth. Just do as I say. Richard's voice was icy cold. I still have the evidence of your embezzlement. Unless you want to be reported to the police. As a co-conspirator in investment fraud, you'll do this. Michael took the bottle with trembling hands, a look of deep regret on his face. I have no choice. He muttered. I got involved in your investment scheme to pay for my daughter's surgery. That was my mistake. Sentiment is unnecessary, Richard sneered. Hurry up. Other members will be here soon. As the footsteps receded, Carol's heart pounded violently. The upcoming rehearsal and the performance. She had to stop Elizabeth from drinking the water, but how? Convince Michael? Inform the security? Warn Elizabeth directly? As the clock hands mercilessly moved forward, Carol resolved to protect her dear friend, even if no one else believed her. Before rehearsal began, Carol observed from behind the dressing room. Michael entered, approached Elizabeth's seat, and took out the small bottle, moving to place it next to the water jug. But he hesitated. I can't do this. Michael whispered. If I do this. Just then, Richard appeared in the dressing room. In an instant, seeing Michael's hesitation, he snatched the bottle from his hand and quickly poured its contents into the water jug. It seems I have to do it myself. Michael slumped against the wall, his face etched with deep despair. Carol was about to act when Elizabeth entered the dressing room. Good morning, everyone. Her cheerful voice filled the room, her face bright with anticipation for today's concert. As she reached for the glass, Elizabeth! Carol shouted. All eyes turned to the suddenly appearing girl. Carol? What's wrong? That water. Carol struggled to find the words. Don't drink it. Richard has. You again, Richard coldly retorted. Elizabeth, this is what happens when you ignore such delusions from a child. It's not a delusion. Carol cried out. I just saw you. Someone call security, Richard told the other members. A homeless person has broken into the dressing room. She might be planning to steal the expensive instruments. The orchestra members looked at Carol with confused expressions. The cellist, Michael, remained silent, trembling against the wall. Wait, Elizabeth raised her voice. Carol, what happened? Richard put something in the water. Another one of your fabrications, Richard interrupted. You're trying to use your position to destroy our trust. Security arrived quickly. Carol desperately looked at Elizabeth. Believe me. Doubt flickered in Elizabeth's eyes. Her husband's words versus the plea of a trusted young girl. Whom to believe? Carol, calm down, Elizabeth said quietly. I understand how you feel, but... Those words chilled Carol's heart. She wasn't believed. She felt powerless to stop what was about to happen. As she was being led away by security, Carol looked back at Elizabeth one last time. A mix of confusion and sadness was evident on her face, while Richard sported a triumphant smile. Thrown outside the building, Carol collapsed onto the cold ground. But she couldn't give up. She had to protect Elizabeth. The clock hands mercilessly moved closer to the performance time. Inside the concert hall, Tchaikovsky's violin concerto filled the air during the final rehearsal before the main event. Elizabeth's violin played passionately. As the first movement ended, the orchestra's music slowly faded away. "Let's stop here," the conductor announced. "Take a break before the performance." Elizabeth returned to the dressing room and carefully placed her violin in its case, treating it like a precious treasure. She sat down at the makeup table, her reflection in the mirror a blend of tension and anticipation. Carol watched desperately through a small window in the emergency exit, careful not to be seen by security. Since being expelled that morning, she had been vigilantly circling the hall. Elizabeth picked up the water pitcher from the dressing table, obviously feeling thirsty. She poured water into a glass. It was the same pitcher that had been there since morning, the one Richard had poisoned. Carol tapped on the window glass. "Elizabeth." But her voice couldn't reach through the soundproof walls. Elizabeth brought the glass to her lips. In a split-second decision, Carol rammed her body against the emergency door. It burst open. "Don't drink it." But it was too late. Elizabeth had already taken a sip. "Carol?" "Why?" Her words were cut off as her face turned deathly pale. Her hands began to tremble. "I feel." She tried to grab the makeup table for support, but seemed too weak. She collapsed to her knees. "Elizabeth." Carol rushed over. Noise erupted outside the dressing room. Richard was the first to burst in. "What happened?" His voice contained feigned surprise. Michael followed, his face draining of color when he saw Elizabeth. He was witnessing the consequences of his involvement. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted. Elizabeth's breathing grew erratic, sweat beading on her forehead. "Carol." She whispered hoarsely. "I'm sorry about this morning, I should have believed your words." "Don't talk." Carol held Elizabeth's hand, fighting back tears. "It's going to be okay, just hang in there." The sound of an approaching ambulance siren grew louder. Richard gave orders, his voice slightly trembling, perhaps panicked by the unforeseen turn of events. Michael stood frozen against the wall, torn about whether to speak the truth. His lips remained firmly sealed, his fear silencing him. Medical personnel arrived and swiftly moved into the dressing room. Elizabeth was placed on a stretcher and carried out. Carol held her hand until they were separated in the hallway. "I want to go with her," Carol pleaded. "Family only," an EMT interjected. Richard stepped forward. "I am her husband." He climbed into the ambulance. As he left, his glance towards Carol carried a cold certainty of victory. With just hours left until the performance, a heavy atmosphere filled the concert hall. Orchestra members exchanged puzzled looks. Michael left the dressing room, pressing his forehead against the corridor wall in despair. Carol stood frozen in front of the emergency exit. She hadn't been able to protect Elizabeth. The regret was suffocating. But she couldn't let it end here. She was determined to uncover the truth. Hurried footsteps echoed down the sterile hospital corridor. 3 hours had passed since Elizabeth was rushed to the hospital, and her condition was deteriorating rapidly. "Please, just 5 minutes," Carol pleaded with the nurse at the counter. Her dusty clothes and disheveled hair marked her as a homeless girl, but her eyes shone with sincerity. "I'm sorry, but we can only allow family members to visit," the nurse said with a puzzled expression. Elizabeth Anderson, the City Symphony's lead violinist, had such an unusual visitor. "Elizabeth is very important to me," Carol struggled to find the right words. How could she explain her relationship with Elizabeth? Do you know something about her? The nurse asked quietly, lowering her voice. There's been a sudden change in her condition, and the police are involved. Yes, I saw something in the rehearsal room. At that moment, another nurse chimed in. This girl, I've seen her often on the street outside. She's always near the back of the concert hall. At the back of the hall? The first nurse looked surprised. I listen to Elizabeth play every day, Carol said clearly, yet quietly. I was there today, and that's why. Her voice choked up. If only she had acted sooner, warned more strongly. Calm down, a kind voice came from behind. Carol turned to see a dignified elderly woman standing there. Reminiscent of Elizabeth in poise. You must be Carol, the woman placed her hand on Carol's shoulder. Elizabeth has told me about you. A girl with a wonderful ear for music. I am Eleanor Hamilton, Elizabeth's grandmother, the woman turned to the nurse. This child is part of my family. Could we visit together, please? Her voice carried an authority that brooked no argument. The nurse nodded silently and began leading the way to the hospital room. I've always wanted to meet you. The grandmother spoke softly as they walked down the hallway. The girl who gave the coat. Elizabeth told me you understand her music best. Carol struggled to hold back tears. Overwhelmed by the idea that Elizabeth had spoken of her in such a way. Upon entering the hospital room, the steady beeping of monitors filled the air. Elizabeth lay pale and wan, and 4-line connected to her arm. A shadow of her usual poised self. Her blood pressure is unstable, a nurse explained. The doctors are rushing to determine the cause. Where is her husband? Another nurse asked. He's at a sudden meeting with a client, Eleanor replied coldly. Unreachable at the moment. Elizabeth. Carol approached the bed. Elizabeth weakly opened her eyes and managed a faint smile. Carol, you came. Her voice was broken, possibly due to the fever, as sweat beaded on her forehead. Hang in there, Carol said, gripping Elizabeth's trembling hand. I'm here for you. Just then, the hospital room door opened, and 2 detectives entered. Excuse us. We need to ask some questions. Of course, Eleanor nodded. But first. She glanced toward Elizabeth. Yes, we'll start with those involved, the older detective said. And. He looked at Carol. Your testimony will be very important. Michael, the cellist, was also visible in the hallway, standing still, peering into the room. His expression bore indescribable torment, hesitating as if fearful of speaking. Detective, Carol spoke up. I need to tell you what I saw. Yes, we'll talk more in a bit, the detective replied kindly. I heard from the nurse that you've been near the dressing room often. Suddenly, Elizabeth's condition worsened. Severe convulsions started. And the monitor began to emit warning beeps. Get a doctor here now, a nurse dashed out. Elizabeth. Carol shouted. Doctors rushed in, issuing rapid-fire instructions. The 4 was swiftly changed, and various devices were brought in. She's showing symptoms of severe food poisoning, a doctor explained. Or rather, it might be poisoning. Carol squeezed Eleanor's hand tightly. Watching someone she cared deeply about suffer, yet without definitive proof to validate the truth, was agonizing. Michael trembled in the hallway, uncertain of Richard's whereabouts. As evening fell, the hospital room filled only with the sounds of monitors. Elizabeth's labored breathing and the soft steps of nurses, accompanied by distant sirens. The truth was still obscured, but Carol was resolved to uncover it. To save and protect Elizabeth. Hospital visiting hours ended, and Carol left the building with heavy steps. While Elizabeth's condition had stabilized, it remained precarious. In the dimly lit parking lot, a voice suddenly spoke from behind. "You managed to visit, huh?" Turning around, Carol saw Richard. His usual immaculate appearance was gone, his suit wrinkled, his tie askew. "The word around town is that you always listened to Elizabeth's performances." Richard stepped closer. "And this morning, you were in the dressing room too." Carol backed away. "There was no one else in the parking lot." "I'll tell the police everything I saw." "And what will that achieve?" Richard's eyes gleamed dangerously. "Whose word do you think will be more trusted, yours or mine?" He pulled an envelope from his inner pocket. "This is enough to start a new life. Take it, leave town, and forget about this morning." "I can't forget," Carol's voice trembled. "Not while Elizabeth is suffering." "Ah, that music-obsessed woman," Richard scoffed. "She's blind to anything but her music. I just needed her to take a little rest because she started to figure out my plans." "You, really?" "There's no proof," Richard said confidently. "The surveillance footage will be erased soon. Michael won't talk. No one will believe." "I'm not afraid of you," Carol managed to keep her voice steady. "Because I have nothing left to lose." "Really?" Richard's voice turned icy. "You're really concerned about Elizabeth, aren't you?" "What happens next, who can say?" Carol felt a chill run down her spine. It was a clear threat. "Decide by tonight," Richard tossed the envelope at Carol's feet. "Disappear, or else." His words trailed off as he vanished into the darkness. Carol picked up the envelope. Inside was an amount of cash she had never seen before, a fortune to a girl living on the streets. Yet, at the concert hall that evening, Richard entered the security room. "Erase the footage," he ordered the security guard. "Tell the police there was a system malfunction. But this is 3 months' salary for you." Another envelope was placed on the table. "It should cover your mother's medical expenses." The guard stared at the envelope, motionless. "No need to hesitate, right?" Richard's voice was cold. "Save your mother, or stand up for some stranger's justice?" "My mother wouldn't want help like this." The guard's voice shook. Just then, Michael entered the room. "Richard, You two will remain silent as a witness." Richard pulled out another envelope. "Think of your daughter's surgery costs." "It's the wise choice." Suddenly, a noise came from outside. "Someone's there." Richard hurried into the corridor as footsteps approached. "It's the police." He fled through the opposite emergency exit, disappearing into the dark back alley. However, several detectives were waiting for him. They had been tailing him since the confrontation with Carol at the hospital earlier that day. Back in the security control room, Michael finally spoke up. "I'll tell you everything," he said. Carol was on her way back to the hospital. The envelope filled with money had already been handed over to the police. Now, at last, the truth was coming to light. She was ready to bring good news to Elizabeth. The streetlights illuminated her small silhouette. She would no longer be intimidated by anyone. She was resolved to do whatever she could to protect those she cared about. That determination quietly lit up within the girl's heart. Sunlight streamed through the hospital room window. Elizabeth's condition was slowly stabilizing. Carol had spent the entire night holding her hand, not sleeping at all. "Carol." Elizabeth's voice was faint. "Elizabeth." Carol looked up. "You've been here all this time." At that moment, detectives entered the room. The one who had been tailing Richard the previous night led the group. "How are you feeling?" one detective asked gently. "Yes, much better," Elizabeth responded weakly. "Lady and Carol," the detective sat down. "Our investigation has revealed quite a bit." Eleanor entered the room, her expression a mix of anger and sadness. "We will soon have enough evidence regarding the misappropriation of funds." From the Music Foundation, the detective began to explain quietly. "Richard Anderson has been diverting donations meant for young musicians to illegal gambling for the past 3 years. Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes. "And to keep you away from your musical activities after you began to suspect." The detective chose his words carefully. "He planned to use poison. We've obtained a detailed statement from Mr. Foster, the cellist." Another detective added. "Richard had been blackmailing him into complicity. We've also secured surveillance footage from the morning Elizabeth collapsed." The senior detective continued. "It recorded everything that happened in the rehearsal room." A heavy silence filled the room. "So it was." Elizabeth's voice trembled. "My music was that much of an obstruction to him." "No," Carol said firmly. "Elizabeth's music isn't an obstruction to anyone. It's something that heals hearts, something precious." Carol choked up. Elizabeth gently squeezed her hand. Richard's father was a famous composer, and his mother was a renowned pianist. Eleanor began quietly. "But he was the only one in the family without musical talent. And he was shunned by his family." "That's right," the detective nodded. "During the interrogation, his boss told us that Richard was the only child in a family of musicians who had no talent. It seems his distorted obsession and hatred for music were behind this incident." "Richard had a brother," Elizabeth said softly, "a child prodigy pianist who died young." "Yes," the detective continued. "After his brother's death, all his parents' expectations turned to Richard. But he couldn't meet them. That's why music and money became everything in his world," Eleanor sighed. "We're also uncovering the full extent of the financial fraud." The detective spread out some documents. "The misuse of funds for gambling, investment fraud, and now attempted murder. Charges are being finalized." "But where is he?" Elizabeth asked. "Don't worry," the detective assured her. "We have eyes on the airports and major stations. He won't be able to run for long." Outside the window, birds chirped as dawn broke, heralding a new morning. "Elizabeth," Carol called softly, "will I be able to hear you play again?" Elizabeth smiled, her expression regaining some of its former strength. "Yes, absolutely. Next time. I want to hear it from the front row." Elizabeth's eyes gleamed warmly. "From the very front." Carol nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from hope. Just when it seemed all was concluded, another detective hurried into the room. "The police have just reported. Richard Anderson was spotted at the port." The air in the room froze for a moment. "The port?" Elizabeth murmured. "He tried to sneak aboard a cargo ship but was spotted by the port authorities." The detective looked at his phone as he stood up. "However, he has not been apprehended yet." "I'll go too," another detective followed. Carol, the senior detective, turned to her. "Your testimony has cornered him." "Thank you." Carol gave a small nod, squeezing Elizabeth's hand a little tighter. As the detectives prepared to leave, hurried footsteps were heard in the hallway. Michael appeared. "Let me go with you, please," he said, his expression determined. "I want to confront Richard myself." The detective paused for a moment, then nodded. At the docks, a cold sea breeze blew. The lights of the port flickered on the dark water surface. Police cars converged, their sirens echoing in the quiet night. Richard Anderson, the police called through a megaphone. "You have nowhere to run." From behind a warehouse, a man appeared. His usual dignity lost, his expensive suit disheveled by the sea wind. "It's all over," a detective approached. "You might as well surrender." "Over?" Richard sneered. "My life was over from the moment I was born." "Richard," Michael stepped forward. "What, you've betrayed me too?" Richard's eyes flashed dangerously. "What will you do after betraying me?" "What about your daughter's surgery expenses?" "I won't be intimidated anymore." Michael's voice trembled, but it was resolute. "My daughter told me she doesn't want her treatment funded by dirty money." "Everyone's a hypocrite," Richard spat disdainfully. "Music? Art? Talent? It's all nonsense." He took a step toward the sea. "Don't move," the police officers shouted in unison. "My life was decided by that family." Richard's voice darkened. "A prodigy brother and parents who worshipped him. Just because I lacked musical talent." His voice began to tremble. "Every day, compared to him, expected to excel, and then blamed." "That's no excuse to endanger someone's life," Michael retorted. "It's the same with Elizabeth," Richard continued. Music, she's blind to reality. It's all about the money." "That's not true," Michael countered firmly. "Elizabeth's music heals people. It even changed the life of a young girl named Carol." At that moment, Richard's foot reached the edge of the pier. "Let's end this," he muttered. "Wait." A detective lunged forward and grabbed Richard's arm. Other officers quickly moved in to restrain him. The sound of handcuffs clicked through the cold night air. "Richard Anderson, you are under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and tampering with evidence," an officer announced. Richard seemed to have lost the will to resist, his head bowed. As the pre-dawn sirens of police vehicles echoed through the harbor, Michael looked towards the eastern sky with a heavy sigh. At the hospital, Carol was holding Elizabeth's hand, gazing out the window as dawn approached. The difficult days were finally coming to an end. "It's over," Elizabeth said quietly. "Yes," Carol nodded. "But for us, it's just beginning." Elizabeth smiled gently. It was a chilly November morning when Elizabeth was discharged from the hospital. Carol waited at the entrance, a bundle of nerves. The green coat she had received from Elizabeth shielded her slender body from the cold wind. "Sorry to keep you waiting." At the sound of Elizabeth's voice, Carol turned to see her sitting in a wheelchair, being pushed out by Eleanor. Although not fully recovered, there was a definite glimmer of improvement in her expression. "So, what will you do now, Carol?" Eleanor asked. "What? Are you planning to go back to the streets?" Carol was at a loss for words. Returning to her previous life was no longer an option. But she didn't know where else to go. "How about coming to live with us?" Elizabeth suggested softly. "Let's live together." "But, someone like me." "We've already started the legal process," Eleanor explained. "The adoption papers are ready." "Elizabeth would be my mother?" Carol's voice quivered. "Yes," Elizabeth smiled. "I want to be your mother." As they drove towards Elizabeth's home, Carol's heart raced with anticipation. New family and, potentially, a new grandfather awaited. Approaching the old mansion, they could hear piano music from inside Elgar's Salad d'Amour, its delicate, warm notes blending with the chilly outside air. Oh, grandfather is playing, Elizabeth smiled. Maybe he's preparing to welcome you. As they entered, the piano's resonating tones grew clearer. The white-haired man at the piano finished his piece and looked up. "Welcome back, Elizabeth," he said warmly. "And you must be Carol." "Welcome." Carol was taken aback by his kind eyes and warm smile. "I am Joseph Hamilton, Elizabeth's grandfather." He stood up slowly. "I've taught at a music university for 40 years, hoping I've nurtured many musicians. But..." He paused. "Elizabeth tells me you have an exceptional ear." I..." Carol stuttered. "Grandfather was my first teacher," Elizabeth explained. "He recognized my talent when I was 5. Identifying talent was my job," Joseph said quietly. "But more importantly, nurturing and guiding that talent." "Grandfather," Elizabeth interjected, "could you give Carol that violin?" "Oh, yes," Eleanor brought out a slender case. "This is for you." Trembling, Carol opened the case to find a glossy, light brown violin. Slightly smaller than an adult size. "This is a 3/4 size violin Elizabeth used when she was 10, Joseph explained. "It's a crucial instrument for transitioning from child to adult sizes. You and Elizabeth have a similar build, so it should fit you perfectly." Carol cautiously took the violin, feeling its right fit. "There's a sequence to learning music," Joseph said softly. "Let's start with understanding the notes correctly." He played a note on the piano. "Do you know what note this is?" "It's an A," Carol responded instantly. Joseph nodded approvingly. "Correct. You have perfect pitch. But I sense more talent in you." "Let's divide the tasks," Elizabeth smiled. "Grandfather will teach you solfège and piano basics, and I'll teach you the violin." "What's solfège?" Carol tilted her head, hearing the term for the first time. "It's the basics of music," Joseph explained. "Intervals, key signatures, rhythm, it's like learning the language of music. Before you start playing the violin, let's start with the basics on the piano, checking notes as you play." Carol seemed a bit nervous at his words. "Don't worry," Joseph continued kindly. "A little bit every day. The piano is very important for understanding music." Elizabeth also practiced her pitch with my piano when she was little. "Yes," Elizabeth reminisced fondly. "Grandfather's piano lessons formed the foundation of my music." Joseph placed another chair in front of the piano and invited Carol to sit. "Shall we start your first lesson?" Carol sat tentatively in front of the piano. Joseph gently played the note C. "Let's sing the scale starting from this note together. C, D, E." Carol's clear voice filled the room. She sang the scale perfectly, without hesitation. Joseph and Elizabeth exchanged looks of amazement. The natural talent was there. "After you learn the basics," Elizabeth said, "I'll teach you how to hold the violin and use the bow." "There's no rush," Joseph added. "Music is a lifelong companion. Take it slowly but steadily." Eleanor listened to Carol's singing with the piano from the kitchen. As she prepared dinner, the pure voice resonated throughout the house. A new family sound was being born here. After dinner, Elizabeth began teaching Carol how to hold the violin. They started without the bow, just placing the instrument on her shoulder. Joseph watched them with a quiet smile. A certain bond beyond blood ties was forming. Along with the eternal language of music, a new harmony was about to be added to this home. On a snowy December morning, after finishing her piano practice taught by Joseph, Carol started preparing for her violin lesson with Elizabeth. The 3/4 size violin had become her dear friend. "Good morning, Carol." Descending the stairs, Carol encountered the elderly neighbor lady, burdened with shopping bags. "Grandma, can I help you carry that?" Carol naturally offered. "Thank you. But aren't you late for your lesson?" "It's okay. I still have time." Carol took the heavy bags. She remembered when, during her days living on the streets, the bakery's grandmother would quietly share leftover bread at closing time. That warm memory now translated into what she could do today. "You're such a kind girl," the grandmother smiled. "I always hear beautiful music coming from your house. You're working hard on your practice, aren't you?" "Yes. Elizabeth and grandfather Joseph teach me very well." Carol carried the bags to the house, then headed to the concert hall for her after-school lesson. "Hello, Carol." At the entrance of the hall, Carol met Mr. Brown, the janitor. He's a man with kind eyes, always greeting with a smile. "Good morning. Are you practicing today?" "Yes. But first, can I help you clean?" Back when Carol listened to music at the hall's back door, Mr. Brown had watched over her without driving her away. It was an unforgettable memory for her. No, practice comes first," Mr. Brown gently shook his head. "But I bought coffee, so how about joining me for a break?" "Thank you." In the lesson room, Elizabeth was preparing the music scores. 3 months had passed, and Carol could now play simple pieces with basic bowing techniques. "Good morning, Carol. Shall we try a new piece today?" "Elizabeth, before that." Carol hesitated a bit. "I have a request." "What is it?" "Next week is Mr. Brown's birthday. Can I play a small piece for him here after he finishes cleaning in the afternoon?" Elizabeth looked surprised. "Mr. Brown's birthday?" "Yes. Ever since the time I was at the back door, he's always been kind to me." Elizabeth's eyes moistened. "That's a wonderful request." "Of course, it's okay. What piece would you like to play?" "I want to practice Amazing Grace." "It's his favorite, just a simple version." "Understood. Let's practice it together." That day's lesson was more focused than usual. Carol's bowing was filled with a pure desire to bring joy. A week later, at 3 p.m. "Mr. Brown, could you come here for a moment?" Elizabeth invited Mr. Brown, who had just finished cleaning, into the practice room. But why me?" Then Carol appeared with the 3/4 size violin, and Joseph sat down at the piano to accompany. "Happy birthday, Mr. Brown." Carol's bow gently touched the strings. The warm melody of Amazing Grace began to fill the room. While her technique was still immature and some notes were unstable, the heartfelt sound definitely reached Mr. Brown's heart. When the performance ended, tears rolled down Mr. Brown's cheeks. "This is the most wonderful gift I've ever received." From that day, Carol's commitment to her practice intensified even more. As spring arrived and cherry blossoms danced, Carol realized for the first time that playing the violin was not just about producing notes. It was about touching people's hearts. That was what music was all about. "Carol, you produced some really nice sounds today," Elizabeth said after a lesson. "Did something change?" "Yeah." Carol blushed slightly. "Today, I was thinking about the grandmother next door while I played. She's been weak recently and can't go out much. I hoped my sound would reach her." Elizabeth hugged Carol silently. Carol continued in a soft voice. If I can make someone happy with my music. Just like how your music encouraged me when I was living on the streets. As summer approaches, Carol's progress began to surprise those around her. While solidly grounded in the basics, there was something special in her music. Carol's music has a strange power, Joseph mentioned during dinner. Something beyond skill. It speaks directly to people's hearts. Yes, Eleanor nodded. The other day, while I was gardening, I was so captivated by the sound of her practice coming from upstairs that before I knew it, an hour had passed. I'm supposed to be teaching her, Elizabeth smiled. Lately, I feel like I'm learning more from her. Oh, I'm not so. Carol blushed. It's not about technique, Elizabeth explained gently. It's about the essence of music, understanding how to reach people's hearts. Something I learned from you. With the arrival of fall, Carol had found a new goal. It was after observing a special lesson for young musicians organized by Elizabeth's orchestra. Hey, Elizabeth. What is it? Someday, I'd like to teach music to children who live on the streets. I hope to give them the same kind of hope that music has given me. Elizabeth gazed into Carol's determined eyes. No longer was there a trace of the streetwise girl. Instead, there stood a young woman nurtured by music and love, possessing a firm resolve. That's a beautiful dream, Elizabeth said. Let's make it come true together. In the practice room at dusk, Carol's violin echoed. The sound, unexplainable by technique alone, held a warm light. Memories of her days on the streets had transformed into a strong desire to help others. 10 years later, in the dressing room of a concert hall bathed in spring sunshine, Carol carefully tuned the strings of her full-sized violin. Now 20, she was a third-year student at Juilliard. Back for a special duo recital with Elizabeth during spring break. It feels nostalgic, doesn't it? Elizabeth entered the dressing room. This place. Carol smiled. This is where I first met you. Who would have thought the girl I found at the back door would become the top student at Juilliard? Pride filled Elizabeth's voice. It's all thanks to grandfather's basic lessons, Carol said kindly. If he hadn't taught me to match pitches on the piano, I might not have been able to keep up with the theory classes at the music academy. Elizabeth placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder. The 10 years had deepened their bond as mother and daughter, and as musicians. There's a special meaning to today's program, isn't there? Elizabeth asked. Carol nodded. Today's repertoire included all the pieces she first heard on the streets, centered around Tchaikovsky's violin concerto. These memories were arranged into duos. The arrangement class at the academy loved it, Carol beamed. Especially the duo version of the concerto. Your arrangements have something special, Elizabeth noted. It's not just the technical perfection. Each note is filled with care for others. Joseph and Eleanor peeked through the door. It's almost showtime, Eleanor announced. The house is full, Joseph added. Mr. Brown is sitting right in the front row. And the neighbor grandma too, Carol said happily. She insisted on coming even though she's in a wheelchair now. It seems your friends from New York have come to support you too, Elizabeth remarked. Carol took a deep breath. The memories of the past 10 years raced through her mind. The days on the streets, meeting Elizabeth. The love of her grandparents, and the deep bond with music. Hey, Elizabeth, Carol spoke quietly. About the street music program starting next month. This was a new project Carol had planned, aimed at providing music education to street-living children. Recognized as part of the Music Academy's community outreach program. Yes, the board approved it unanimously, Elizabeth replied. Your experience and passion moved everyone. I'll definitely help during my breaks, Eleanor added. Joseph will take care of the basic lessons. Tears welled up in Carol's eyes. Thank you, everyone. The stage manager opened the door. It's time. Mother and daughter exchanged a silent nod. As they walked down the corridor to the stage, Carol remembered herself 10 years ago, the girl who sought solace in music. At the back door of this building, now able to bring hope to others. Let's go, Elizabeth said. As they appeared on stage, applause erupted. Carol scanned the audience, Brown. The neighbor grandmother, cellist Michael, friends from the academy. And potential future students. This music was sure to change someone's life. Elizabeth started the first note, and Carol's violin responded. Together, their sounds mingled beautifully, enveloping the hall with a love transcending blood ties, becoming an eternal melody.